So there's this very specific type of 90s movie that only could have existed during that exact period of time. The economy was technically okay. Everybody claimed Generation X was cynical and lazy. Coffee shops suddenly became personality traits, and Hollywood became absolutely obsessed with movies about unemployed people standing around talking, which gave us films like Reality Bites, Singles, and eventually SubUrbia. Now, if you've never seen SubUrbia before, you might assume from the marketing that this is some quirky little Gen X comedy about lovable burnouts hanging around outside a convenience store. It is not. This movie has the emotional atmosphere of somebody realizing at 3 a.m. that they wasted their 20s. And honestly, I kind of love it for that. Because unlike a lot of slacker movies from the 90s, SubUrbia doesn't really romanticize being lost. There's no cool fantasy here, no glamorous rebellion, no hidden wisdom in doing absolutely nothing with your life. These characters aren't cool. They aren't rebels. Most of them aren't even particularly funny. They're just stuck. And that's what makes this movie weirdly depressing and weirdly honest. It feels less like a traditional film and more like accidentally overhearing a group of former high school kids slowly realizing adulthood is real and they are catastrophically unprepared for it. Which makes this one of the last true slacker movies before the entire vibe of the 1990s started collapsing into late 90s corporate emptiness. The slacker era was already dying. To really understand SubUrbia, you kind of have to understand where America was emotionally in the mid-1990s. Because by the time this movie came out, the whole slacker generation thing was already running on fumes. Back in the early 90s, Hollywood was fascinated by Gen X. You suddenly had all these movies about young adults drifting through life trying to figure themselves out. Nobody had careers, everybody was sarcastic, every apartment somehow looked affordable despite nobody having jobs. And for a while, that vibe felt fresh. Movies like Clerks and Slacker made aimlessness feel philosophical. Even when characters were broke or confused, there was still this underlying feeling that maybe they were secretly smarter than mainstream society. Like not participating in adulthood was somehow its own form of rebellion. But by the mid-90s, that whole fantasy was starting to crack because eventually irony stops paying the bills. And SubUrbia feels like one of the first movies to fully understand that. This isn't a movie about cool outsiders rejecting society. This is a movie about people who got left behind by life and don't know how to process it. That's why the tone feels so different compared to other slacker films. There's barely any wink-wink humor here, no exaggerated quirky moments, no soundtrack desperately trying to convince you these people are iconic. The movie just sits there and forces you to exist with them. And honestly, that's uncomfortable. Because everybody in this movie feels like they peaked emotionally somewhere around senior year of high school. They talk constantly about leaving town, but nobody actually leaves. They make plans, but immediately destroy their own plans. Every conversation somehow turns into an argument about failure, disappointment, or whose life sucks more. It's like watching people emotionally rot in real time. And the older you get, the more terrifying this movie becomes. Because most slacker movies sell freedom. SubUrbia sells stagnation. And that's probably why it got marketed completely wrong. The advertisements tried so hard to make this look like some edgy youth comedy. But this movie isn't funny in the traditional sense. It reminds me more of River's Edge, that bleak Keanu Reeves movie where everybody reacts to horrible situations with this weird emotional numbness. That same feeling exists in SubUrbia. Everybody's alive physically, but mentally they already feel checked out. And maybe that's why the movie still works today. Because underneath all the 90s clothes and alternative rock energy, this is really a movie about fear. Fear of growing up, fear of failure, fear that maybe your hometown was never temporary. And the scariest part? Some of these characters don't even realize they're trapped anymore. So today, we're going to talk about how Suburbia got made, why it feels so different from other Gen X films, why everybody in this movie desperately needs therapy and employment, and why the smartest person in the entire movie is the guy running the convenience stores. If you enjoy deep dives into weird nostalgic movies, forgotten TV shows, Gen X chaos, dead mall energy, and emotionally damaged characters standing around parking lots pretending they're philosophically profound, then go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe, because apparently that's how we appease the algorithm now. How Suburbia became an existential parking lot. One of the reasons Suburbia feels so different from other 90s movies is because it didn't actually start as a movie. It started as a stage play, which honestly makes complete sense once you watch it, because this entire film feels like a theatrical panic attack happening outside a convenience store at midnight. The original play was written by Eric Bogosian, and you can feel the stage play DNA all over this thing. There's barely any traditional plot movement. Nobody's going on a quest. Nobody's solving a mystery. Instead, the movie's just people talking. Talking and talking and talking. Interrupting each other. Starting arguments for absolutely no reason. Bringing up emotional trauma from high school like it happened last week. And somehow, that becomes the entire movie. But weirdly, that's also why it works. Because Suburbia doesn't feel written in the polished Hollywood sense. It feels overheard. Like somebody secretly recorded a group of emotionally stranded 20-somethings outside a gas station and accidentally captured an entire generation quietly falling apart. And then, somehow, this material ended up being directed by Richard Linklater, which, honestly, feels almost too perfect, because if there was ever a filmmaker designed in a laboratory specifically to direct people standing around discussing existential disappointment, it's Richard Linklater. This is the guy behind Slacker. The man practically invented cinematic loitering. And normally, Linklater's movies have this warmth to them. Even when characters are lost or confused, there's usually still this sense that life is full of possibility. But Suburbia? This movie feels exhausted, like everybody already burned through their optimism before turning 25. And the genius of Linklater's direction is that he never tries to romanticize these characters. That's important, because a lesser movie would have turned this into a quirky indie comedy where everybody's secretly charming underneath the dysfunction. But Suburbia refuses to do that. These people can be annoying, cruel, petty, emotionally immature, sometimes within the same conversation. And yet, they still feel real, painfully real, because the movie understands something deeply uncomfortable about your early 20s. A lot of people are still mentally living in high school. That's why every conversation in this movie feels trapped in the past. Everybody keeps recycling old stories, old grudges, old relationships, old identities, like they physically grew older, but emotionally never left the parking lot. And honestly, that's why the convenience store setting works so brilliantly. A convenience store is supposed to be temporary. You stop there for a few minutes, then continue your life somewhere else. But these characters never continue. They just stay there, night after night, emotionally haunting a parking lot like suburban ghosts. And by the time Suburbia premiered in 1997, the timing accidentally became perfect, because the entire Slacker era was starting to collapse. Grunge had already become commercialized. Alternative culture was turning corporate. The 90s dream of drifting through life indefinitely was starting to run directly into adulthood. And suddenly, being directionless didn't feel rebellious anymore. It felt dangerous, which is why Suburbia doesn't really play like a celebration of Gen X culture. It plays like the moment that culture realized the party was over and nobody knew where to go next. So what actually happens in Suburbia? Trying to explain the plot of Suburbia is honestly kinda difficult, because technically, the movie is about a group of friends hanging around outside a convenience store for one night. That's it. That's the movie. No secret treasure maps, no alien invasions, just emotionally damaged 20-somethings unraveling in a parking lot. And somehow, it becomes one of the most depressing movies of the entire 1990s. And the story centers around a group of suburban burnouts hanging around what they call the corner, basically outside this convenience store owned by Nazir and Pakessa. And immediately, the movie gives you this feeling that these people have been doing this exact routine for way too long. They drink beer, they smoke, they insult each other constantly. They bring up old high school stories like retired athletes reliving championship games, and every single conversation somehow circles back to disappointment, or failure, or whose life turned out worse. It's basically existential dread with fluorescent lighting. And at the center of the group is Jeff. And wow, is Jeff frustrating. Jeff is one of those people who mistakes cynicism for intelligence. Every time somebody mentions a dream, or a plan, or even basic human ambition, Jeff immediately shuts it down like optimism personally offended him. Jobs are pointless, dreams are fake, success is meaningless. This man treats hope like a pyramid scheme. And what makes him exhausting isn't just that he's stuck, it's that he actively tries to keep everyone else stuck too. There's this constant feeling that Jeff would rather emotionally rot in this parking lot forever than risk trying and discovering he's ordinary. And honestly, the older you get, the less cool Jeff becomes. When you're younger, he can seem rebellious, but as an adult, he mostly just feels terrified. Then there's Suze. Now, the movie clearly wants us to see Suze as someone trying to escape this environment. She talks about wanting to be an artist. She wants to leave town. She wants something bigger than this life. But honestly, I still found her almost as frustrating as everybody else. Because she talks about wanting more, but never really knows what more means. She just knows she hates being stuck here. And then Pony shows up. Ah, yes, Pony, the mythical escaped suburban rock star. This man left town, moved to Los Angeles, joined a band, and now returns to Suburbia like he's a war hero coming back from battle. And the second he arrives, the entire energy of the group changes, because Pony represents something none of them have anymore: movement, possibility, escape. Now, what's interesting watching this movie today is that Pony doesn't actually seem that impressive. Back in the 90s, just being in a band automatically gave somebody mystique, especially if they lived in LA. Didn't matter if they were genuinely successful. If a guy had toured a little and knew people in the music scene, suddenly he became this symbol of freedom. Meanwhile, in the 2020s, Pony would probably just be a guy posting blurry tour flyers on Instagram while saying the algorithm ruined music. The illusion breaks much faster now. But Suze gets pulled toward him immediately because she isn't really falling for Pony himself, she's falling for the idea of escape. And honestly, I don't think her ending would turn out much better either, because the movie quietly suggests that none of these people actually know how to build a future. They only know how to fantasize about one. Then there's Tim, and Tim might actually be the saddest character in the movie, because Tim is the guy who almost escaped. He joined the military, he left town, he tried to become somebody else. But now, he's back, angry at everything, carrying around this bitterness like adulthood personally betrayed him. And the tragedy is that you can tell Tim genuinely expected life to transform him once he left Suburbia. But when that didn't happen, he came back emotionally broken. which honestly feels painfully realistic. Then there's Buff. Technically, Buff is comic relief, except the movie isn't really interested in letting anybody become fully comic relief. Because underneath all the jokes and chaotic energy, Buff feels just as directionless as everybody else. He talks loudly, acts ridiculous, keeps the energy moving, but the entire time, you get the feeling that silence would absolutely destroy this man psychologically. And that's what makes Suburbia feel so different from other slacker movies. Most slacker films romanticize drifting through life. This movie doesn't at all. Nobody here feels secretly wise or misunderstood. Most of them just feel scared. Scared of adulthood, scared of responsibility, scared that high school might have been the last time life made sense. And the movie never gives them a magical breakthrough. The night just slowly falls apart. People fight, relationships crack, dreams feel smaller and smaller. One of the most fascinating things about Suburbia is that the smartest character in the entire movie is the guy who barely wants these people around in the first place. Nazir, the convenience store owner, spends most of the film watching this group of suburban burnouts stand outside his business every night, slowly arguing themselves into emotional paralysis. And honestly, the more you think about it, the more his frustration makes complete sense. Because while these characters spend their nights drinking beer next to a dumpster and talking about dreams they'll never pursue, Nazir is actually building something. The movie mentions he's studying engineering. He has goals, a schedule, direction. Meanwhile, the main cast treats adulthood like it's some kind of government conspiracy. And what makes this dynamic so interesting is that the film quietly flips the entire slacker movie formula upside down. Normally, in these kinds of 90s films, the aimless young people are portrayed as secretly wiser than mainstream society. The working adults are boring, corporate culture is fake, drifters are the real thinkers. But Suburbia doesn't really buy into that fantasy, because every time Nazir looks at these people, you can practically see him thinking, you all had every advantage imaginable and somehow still chose this. And the uncomfortable part is, he's kind of right. Now granted, Nazir can absolutely come across judgmental. There's this edge to the character where he clearly looks down on the people hanging around his business, but at the same time, imagine working long, exhausting hours trying to build a future for yourself while a group of privileged suburban kids spend every night outside your business debating whether effort is even worth it. You'd probably lose patience too. And I think that's part of why the movie still feels surprisingly modern, because underneath all the Gen X dialogue and alternative rock atmosphere, Suburbia is really about people reacting differently to disappointment. Some people adapt, some people push forward, and some people completely surrender to stagnation while convincing themselves they're too smart for normal life. Jeff is the clearest example of this. Jeff has fully transformed cynicism into an identity. He rejects jobs, rejects ambition, rejects responsibility. But the movie never presents this as cool rebellion. It presents it as emotional cowardice. That's the key difference. And honestly, the older you get, the less charming Jeff becomes. When you're younger, he can seem rebellious or brutally honest. But as an adult, you start realizing this guy doesn't hate the system because he understands it. He hates the system because participating in life might require risking failure. So instead, he stays frozen. Which is why Susan eventually pulling away from him feels inevitable. Because at some point, cynicism stops sounding intelligent and starts sounding exhausting. And meanwhile, Tim represents a different kind of failure entirely. Tim is what happens when somebody actually does try to escape, but comes back emotionally defeated. He's bitter in this very specific way where you can tell he imagined adulthood turning out differently. He thought leaving town would magically transform him into somebody important. But when that didn't happen, he came back carrying all that resentment with him.
And that's what makes Suburbia more depressing than most slacker movies. There's no romance to any of this. No fantasy that these people are secretly artists, philosophers, or misunderstood geniuses. Sometimes they're just immature adults refusing to move forward. And the movie's brutally honest about how sad that can become. Which is probably why the convenience store owner ends up feeling like the only person who can actually see the full picture. Everybody else is trapped emotionally inside the parking lot. Nazir's the only one already thinking about tomorrow. Everybody here is chasing a fantasy. The older I get, the more Suburbia starts feeling less like a movie about slackers and more like a movie about people lying to themselves. Because almost every major character is desperately clinging to some fantasy version of who they think they are. And the biggest example of that is Jeff. Now look, slacker characters can work. There's a reason people connected with movies like Clerks or even parts of Reality Bites. Those characters were cynical, sure, but there was usually still something underneath the sarcasm. Creativity, ambition, intelligence, a personality beyond life bad. Modern culture is so oversaturated with influencers, musicians, podcasters, TikTok personalities, and fake internet fame that somebody like Pony no longer automatically feels mysterious or important. In the 90s, distance created mystique. Now, everybody sees behind the curtain instantly. And that actually makes Suze's attraction to him more tragic in hindsight, because she isn't really falling for Pony himself. She's falling for what he represents: movement, escape, possibility. She sees LA and music and attention and thinks maybe this is the doorway out of my life. But honestly, I don't think her story ends well either. I could absolutely see Suze eventually realizing Pony isn't some deep artistic savior. He's just another guy trying to maintain the image of being somebody important. And once the fantasy wears off, she probably ends up just as lost somewhere else. Because that's one of the harshest things Suburbia quietly suggests. Changing locations doesn't automatically change people. And then there's Buff. Buff is loud, chaotic, ridiculous, constantly joking, but underneath all that energy is somebody just as directionless as everyone else. He talks about leaving too, but again, leaving to do what exactly? Nobody in this movie has actual plans. They have vibes, which honestly might be the most accurate portrayal of your early 20s ever put on film. But the character that really bothered me by the end was BB. Because BB is basically the only person in this entire movie who feels remotely functional. She's a nurse. She has a real job. She actually contributes to society. In a movie filled with emotional teenagers trapped in adult bodies, BB feels like one of the only people who genuinely crossed over into adulthood. Which is exactly why her ending feels so unfair. The movie almost punishes her for being stable. And that ending always bothered me because it feels like the universe of Suburbia drags everybody down eventually. Nobody escapes cleanly. Not Jeff, not Suze, not Tim, not Buff, and maybe not even Pony. The movie's worldview is so bleak that even the sane people get swallowed by the chaos eventually. Which is honestly probably why Suburbia still sticks with people decades later. Because underneath all the slacker dialogue and 90s alternative aesthetics, it's really about people who confused standing still with freedom.
So yeah, Suburbia might honestly be one of the most brutally honest movies ever made about people emotionally trapped between adolescence and adulthood. Not glamorous, not inspirational, not even particularly hopeful. Just a long, blurry night filled with people realizing life is moving forward whether they're ready or not. And honestly, that's probably why the movie still sticks with people decades later. Anyway, if you enjoyed this deep dive into suburban existential dread, forgotten Gen X cinema, and parking lot philosophy, be sure to like, subscribe, and join the Couch Potato crew. Because around here, we specialize in nostalgic comfort media and occasionally emotional damage. Also, let me know down in the comments what forgotten slacker movie we should cover next. And as always, thanks for hanging out on the couch with me.